Wait, are they? Let's investigate. So I made a video early on in this channel that was called Paper Games and Paper Computer Games. What's the difference? And in that video I show you just how different they are, but since that video, a lot has changed. A lot of people from the paper game community have started making their own PCGs and joined the PCG community as well, but they brought with them a lot from paper games. So much that it leads me to ask, are paper games and paper computer games merging? Let's consider the evidence. A lot of people have added a play button on the cover that you have to press in order to start the game. That's an element of paper games, not PCGs. People have started making PCG consoles. The Sonic Activist was the first to do this, but plenty of others have followed. This is definitely a paper game thing. The tradition originates from IPGS, from paper games, not from PCGs. And just the gameplay itself. I mean, there have been a few people who have made games that they called PCGs, but have gameplay closer to that of a paper game. I still count them as PCGs, but mainly just because their creators do. So it's pretty clear that at the very least the line between paper games and PCGs has gotten fuzzier. But does that necessarily mean they're merging? I mean, what counts as a paper game in the first place? You know, in my other video about the difference between them, I make it seem like paper games are one thing. They're games where you control your character with a paper controller. But what about games that don't fit into that, but are still counted as paper games? Like these games where you turn knobs to move and jump, or Flamespot's games where, well, he makes a whole lot of different kinds of games, but none of them are like traditional paper games. So paper game has always been sort of an umbrella term for a bunch of different kinds of game. With paper computer games, it's the same way. There's the traditional PCGs that everyone knows, where two people play by one person saying what they're going to do and the other person telling them whether it works. But what about games like ZP's Quest, where you basically follow instructions on the paper? What about games like Swamp Survival, which are played like a PCG but are single player, and that person makes up what happens? And Detuned Paper in general is interesting because he's always been a paper game channel. He was originally called Paper Game Co., but when someone pointed out that his games are more like paper computer games, he agreed that they are. He didn't change anything about his games, but he started calling them PCGs. I mean, did they suddenly become PCGs? Were they always PCGs? Or were they always paper games? Maybe a little of both. How can you tell which is which? Is there objectively a kind of gameplay that makes it a paper game or a PCG or something else? Or is it just whatever the creator says it is? If I make a game that's exactly like a paper game in every way, but I call it a PCG, is it a PCG? Or is it a paper game? Well, there is one way to get a handle on this. Instead of looking at the characteristics of the game itself, you could consider what tradition it's part of. I mean, if someone was inspired to make games by watching IPGS and he's trying to build on what IPGS did, or KKT or Reality Stupid or JPGS or any of the other successors, then we could consider that a paper game, even if it's very different, like Flamespot's games. And if they're inspired by me and Chris and trying to build on our games, they could be counted as PCGs, even if they're very different, like, again, Flamespot's games, because he also makes some PCGs. Problem solved, right? Now we can cleanly separate them into two categories. Well, three actually. Paper games, PCGs, and other. Because some people weren't inspired by either tradition. They're just making their own games on paper. But wait a second. What if someone's inspired by both categories? I mean, a person who makes a PCG console and puts TutorialBot on it, well, you can't really say that's completely inspired by PCGs. It's a console. That was IPGS's idea. But you can't really say it's completely inspired by paper games either, Because, I mean, come on, it has tutorial bot on it. It even has PCG in the title a lot of the time, like the PCG float or the PCG keyboard. So, okay, any way you look at it, it's just not that clear. There's no clear wall between paper games and PCGs. But there's also some movement to keep them separate. I mean, JPGS is making sure to continue making paper games while he also makes PCGs, and he keeps them pretty separate. So even though the line is kind of fuzzy, it's not clear if they'll continue to merge or if they'll get further apart over time. But there's one thing that is clear to me. Paper gaming in general, both paper games and PCGs together, are an amazing community that's constantly inspiring each other to be creative in ways they hadn't thought of before. Maybe that's kind of the point. It's the nature of paper computer games to always experiment, to try new things, to break with tradition, even while carrying on a tradition. And that's absolutely true of paper games as well. So it's only natural that people will try mixing them, creating games with elements of both. That's the nature of PCGs, and it's the nature of paper games as well. They will grow, and they have to grow. Because that's the other thing. Paper games have been dying, and so have PCGs. But they never quite die, you know? They both somehow always seem to come back and inspire new people to keep them going. Neither have completely died out, which is incredible. But here's the thing. We want these communities, this community, to do more than barely survive. We want it to grow. We want it to become bigger and richer than any of us today can imagine. And for the first time, we have an opportunity to do that. Paper games bring the visceral feeling of moving with the controller and a rich tradition of making consoles, of making adventures. Paper games look great on YouTube and they spread easily. They can be played by the person who made them and they're easy to get into. And paper computer games bring the depth of playing with another person that lets you ask questions about the game's world and explore it and try things. And it brings a connected universe with characters like Zuvak, TutorialBot, and so many more. Paper games existing make paper computer games better, and vice versa. The fact that people have made PCG consoles makes paper computer games so much richer and so much stronger. It helps them grow. And the other way around too. Folks, we have an opportunity here because together, PCGs and paper computer games can build on each other's strengths to grow beyond our wildest dreams. Who's with me?